The next morning, Marcus woke up to the faint sound of birds chirping outside his window. The sun streamed through the cracks in the curtains, filling his small apartment with a warm, golden light. For a moment, he lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous day in his mind. It had been an ordinary afternoon, or so it seemed at first, but by the end of it, he'd found himself at the center of something far greater than he could have anticipated. Yet, as he stretched and got out of bed, he reminded himself that life wasn't defined by singular moments. It was shaped by the choices we made every single day. After brewing a cup of coffee, Marcus sat by the window, sipping slowly as he watched the city come alive. People hurried along the streets below, some heading to work, others walking their dogs or stopping at cafes for breakfast. To them, it was just another day. But Marcus couldn't help but wonder how many of those people had seen the viral video or heard about what happened in the square. Would they recognize him if they passed him on the street? Probably not. And that was fine with him. He didn't need acknowledgement to know he'd done the right thing. Later that afternoon, Marcus decided to visit the War Memorial again. There was something comforting about the quiet dignity of the place, a stark contrast to the chaos of the world beyond its borders. As he stood before the engraved names, running his fingers lightly over the cool stone, he reflected on the legacy of those who had served before him. Their sacrifices had paved the way for peace, stability, and freedom, values Marcus had fought to uphold during his time in the military. Now, back in civilian life, he realized his role hadn't ended, it had simply evolved. While he was lost in thought, a familiar voice called out from behind him. Turning, he saw the elderly woman from the day before, the one who had thanked him so earnestly. She smiled warmly as she approached, holding another bouquet of flowers. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly. "I wanted to bring these. It's tradition for me to visit once a week." Marcus nodded, stepping aside to give her space. "It's a beautiful tradition," he replied. "They'd appreciate it, I'm sure." The woman placed the flowers gently at the base of the monument, then turned to face him. Her eyes sparkled with gratitude as she spoke. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about courage being about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." She paused, her gaze steady. "You're living proof of that, Mr. Black, and I just wanted to say, thank you. Again." Her words struck a chord deep within Marcus. He wasn't used to being seen as a role model, but in that moment, he understood the weight of his actions. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about setting an example, showing others that kindness and strength weren't mutually exclusive. With a humble smile, he shook her hand once more. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for reminding me why it matters." As the woman walked away, Marcus lingered a little longer, letting the stillness of the memorial wash over him. Eventually, he turned and began making his way back toward the square. Along the way, he noticed a group of kids playing near the fountain, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. One of them, a boy who looked strikingly similar to the child from the day before, waved enthusiastically when he spotted Marcus. "Hey, it's the soldier guy," the boy shouted, pointing. Marcus chuckled, raising a hand in greeting. The boy ran over, clutching the same toy soldier from before. "Can I ask you something?" he asked eagerly, his eyes wide with curiosity. "How do you stay so brave?" The question caught Marcus off guard, but he knelt down to meet the boy's gaze. "Bravery isn't about never being afraid," he explained gently. "It's about feeling scared and doing the right thing anyway. You'll figure it out as you grow up, okay?" The boy nodded solemnly, clutching his toy tighter. "I want to be like you when I'm big," he declared, grinning from ear to ear. Marcus ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "Just promise me one thing," he said with a wink. "Be kinder than I was yesterday." With that, he stood up and continued on his way, leaving the boy to rejoin his friends. As he strolled through the square, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Life after the military wasn't about leaving everything behind. It was about carrying forward the lessons he learned and sharing them with the world. Whether it was stopping a reckless thug, comforting a grieving grandmother, or inspiring a curious child, every action mattered. And in those moments, Marcus realized he was still serving, not on a battlefield, but in the everyday lives of those around him. By the time he reached the edge of the square, the sun was beginning to set once more. By the time Marcus left the war memorial, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The square was quieter now, the earlier chaos replaced by a peaceful stillness. Streetlights flickered on, casting soft glows over the cobblestones as the last few vendors packed up their carts for the night. Though the day's events were behind him, Marcus couldn't help but feel their lingering impact. It wasn't just the confrontation with Derek or the praise from strangers. It was the realization that even ordinary moments could leave extraordinary imprints. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a notification flashing across the screen. "Your video is going viral." Curious, he tapped it open and found himself staring at footage of the altercation earlier that afternoon. Someone in the crowd had recorded the entire scene, the way Derek had lunged at him, how Marcus had calmly deflected the attack, and the moment he'd subdued the thug with precision and restraint. The clip had already amassed thousands of views, along with hundreds of comments. "Wow, this guy's a real-life hero." One comment read, "Veterans are the best." Another added, "Always stepping up when it matters most. Can we clone this man?" Joked a third, accompanied by a string of laughing emojis. Marcus scrolled through the responses, his brow furrowing slightly. He wasn't comfortable being in the spotlight, especially not like this. To him, what he'd done wasn't heroic. It was instinctual, almost automatic. But the reactions told a different story. People weren't just impressed. They were inspired. They saw something in him that reminded them of strength, discipline, and integrity, qualities that seemed increasingly rare in today's world. Deciding not to dwell on it, Marcus tucked his phone back into his pocket. Social media would do what it always did, blow things out of proportion until they lost all sense of reality. What mattered was the here and now, the tangible connections he'd made that day. Like the elderly woman who'd thanked him for reminding her of her grandson, or the young boy who'd looked at him with wide-eyed admiration. Those interactions meant far more than any online likes or shares ever could. Meanwhile, across town, Derek Hale sat slumped in a holding cell at the local police station. His bravado had evaporated entirely, replaced by a mix of anger and regret. The cuffs around his wrists chafed against his skin, but it was nothing compared to the sting of humiliation he felt. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus's calm, unshakable gaze staring back at him. That look had cut deeper than any insult or punch ever could. It had exposed his insecurities, his need to prove himself through aggression and intimidation. The officers hadn't been kind to him either. After hauling him in, they'd lectured him about public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and assaulting a veteran, all charges that carried hefty consequences. "You're lucky he didn't press charges," one officer said sternly, tossing Derek's belongings onto the table. "If I were him, I wouldn't have shown you half the mercy he did." Derek clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. Mercy? Was that what it was? Or was it pity? Either way, it gnawed at him, eating away at his pride. For years, he'd relied on fear to get what he wanted, to assert control over situations. But today, he'd come face to face with someone who couldn't be intimidated, and it had shaken him to his core. As the hours dragged on, Derek began to reflect. Not deeply, but enough to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, he'd crossed a line. Maybe picking fights with strangers in broad daylight wasn't the smartest move. And maybe, if he ever got out of this mess, he'd think twice before throwing punches again. Back in the square, life continued as usual. Tourists snapped photos of the palace gates bathed in golden light, couples strolled hand in hand, and children laughed as they chased each other through the fading evening glow. To them, The drama of the afternoon was already becoming a distant memory, a fleeting moment of excitement in an otherwise ordinary day. But for Marcus, it served as a reminder of something profound. Every action, no matter how small, had the power to shape the world around him. And as he disappeared into the twilight, blending seamlessly into the crowd, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He didn't need recognition or applause to know he'd made a difference. Sometimes, simply doing the right thing was reward enough. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the square, Marcus decided to take a quiet walk. The adrenaline from the earlier confrontation had faded, leaving him with a sense of calm reflection. He wasn't one to dwell on things, but today felt different. The way people had reacted, clapping, thanking him, even calling him a hero, it was humbling. It reminded him that small actions could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he might never fully understand. His steps carried him toward the edge of the square, where a war memorial stood solemnly under the shade of ancient oak trees. The monument was simple yet powerful, a polished stone slab engraved with the names of those who had given their lives in service to their country. Marcus had visited it many times before, finding solace in its quiet dignity. Today, however, the memorial seemed to hold even more meaning. As he approached, he noticed an elderly woman standing there, her hands clasped tightly around a bouquet of flowers. The woman turned as Marcus drew closer, her eyes meeting his. There was something familiar about her expression, a mix of sadness and gratitude that tugged at his heart. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Were you the man from earlier? The one who stopped that troublemaker?" Marcus nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to make a big deal out of what had happened, but the woman's earnest tone made it clear she needed to speak. "Yes, Mom," he replied gently. "That was me." Tears welled up in her eyes as she extended a hand toward him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My grandson is serving overseas right now. Seeing how you handled yourself today, it reminded me of him, of all of you." She gestured vaguely toward the memorial behind her. "Men and women like you. You give us hope. You show us what true courage looks like." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction, and it caught him off guard. For years, he'd struggled with the transition back to civilian life, wondering if he still had a purpose outside the military. But here was this stranger reminding him that his experiences, the lessons he'd learned, the values he'd upheld, still mattered. They always would. He shook her hand firmly, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Your grandson is lucky to have someone like you supporting him," he said sincerely. "And thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." The woman nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. After a moment, she placed the bouquet of flowers at the base of the memorial and took a step back. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice steadier now. With one last grateful glance, she turned and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. Standing there in the fading light, Marcus let his gaze drift over the names etched into the stone. Each one represented a life cut short, a story left unfinished. He wondered about their families, their friends, the people they'd left behind. And he thought about the soldiers still serving, far from home, carrying the weight of duty on their shoulders. It was easy to feel disconnected sometimes, especially after leaving the military, but moments like these reminded him that the bonds of service never truly disappeared. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above him, and Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, breathing it in. When he opened them again, he noticed a young boy lingering nearby, watching him curiously. The child couldn't have been older than 10, his hair tousled, and his clothes slightly too big for his frame. In his hand, he clutched a toy soldier, its paint chipped from use. "Hi," the boy said shyly, taking a hesitant step closer. "Are you a soldier?" Marcus crouched down to meet the boy at eye level, his expression softening. "I used to be," he replied. "But I'm just a regular guy now." The boy tilted his head, clearly unconvinced. "You don't look like a regular guy," he said matter-of-factly. "You look like a superhero." Marcus chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Well, I'm no superhero," he said, ruffling the boy's hair playfully. "But I'll tell you something important. Being brave isn't about wearing a uniform or having superpowers. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Can you remember that?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, clutching his toy soldier tighter. Then, to Marcus's surprise, he raised his hand in a clumsy salute. Without hesitation, Marcus returned the gesture, his own salute crisp and precise. The boy grinned from ear to ear, his admiration shining brightly. As the boy ran off to join his parents, Marcus straightened up, feeling a renewed sense of clarity. Life after the military wasn't about leaving everything behind. It was about carrying forward the lessons he'd learned and sharing them with others. Whether it was, as Derek stumbled away, his shoulders hunched and his face flushed with a mix of anger and shame, the crowd began to disperse slowly. The tension that had gripped the square just moments ago melted into a buzz of conversation. People were eager to share their thoughts about what they'd witnessed, some praising Marcus for his calm and skillful handling of the situation, others shaking their heads at Derek's reckless behavior. But before the moment could fade completely, two members of the Royal Guard stepped forward, their polished boots clicking against the cobblestones. The guards moved with purpose, their crimson uniforms standing out vividly against the neutral tones of the square. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and an air of authority, approached Marcus first. "Sir," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "we'll take it from here." His gaze flicked briefly toward the direction Derek had fled, then back to Marcus. There was no accusation in his tone, only professionalism, and perhaps a hint of admiration. Marcus nodded without hesitation, stepping aside as the guards took charge. He didn't need to explain himself. The scene had unfolded in plain view of dozens of witnesses. Still, one of the guards paused for a moment, looking directly at Marcus. "Thank you for your restraint, sir," he added, his words carrying genuine appreciation. Not everyone would have handled that so diplomatically. The comment caught Marcus off guard, though he didn't show it. Diplomacy wasn't something he thought much about. It was simply second nature to him. Years of military training had drilled into him the importance of staying calm under pressure, of thinking before acting. To him, this had been nothing more than another challenge to navigate, another test of discipline. But hearing those words from someone whose job it was to maintain order made him pause for a moment. The other guard, a younger woman with keen eyes, chimed in. "We'll make sure he doesn't cause any more trouble today," she said, gesturing vaguely in Derek's direction. Her tone was confident, but there was also a subtle note of curiosity in her voice, as if she wanted to ask Marcus more about who he was and where he'd learned to handle himself so effectively. She didn't, though. Instead, she gave him a small nod before turning to follow her colleague, who was already scanning the area for signs of Derek. With the guards now focused on tracking down the fleeing troublemaker, Marcus found himself alone again, or as alone as one could be in a crowded square. Several people lingered nearby, clearly reluctant to leave the scene entirely. Some approached him hesitantly, offering thanks or praise. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes touched his arm gently. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "That man had no business acting like that, especially not here." Others echoed similar sentiments, their voices filled with gratitude. One teenager even asked if he could shake Marcus's hand, which Marcus obliged with a faint smile. Despite the attention, he remained humble, brushing off compliments with quiet modesty. "I just did what anyone else would have done," he replied when someone called him a hero. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have reacted the way he did, not with such composure, not with such precision. As the crowd thinned out and life in the square began to return to normal, Marcus took a step back, leaning against the same lamppost where he'd been standing earlier. He exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. It wasn't every day that he found himself in the spotlight like this, and while he didn't seek recognition, he couldn't deny that the experience left him feeling reflective. He glanced toward the palace gates, where the remaining royal guards stood watchful and unwavering. Their presence reminded him of the values he held dear: duty, honor, and service. Though his time in uniform was behind him, moments like these reaffirmed that those principles still guided him, shaping the way he interacted with the world. And as he watched the guards disappear around a corner in pursuit of Derek, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Perhaps being the civilian didn't mean leaving everything behind. It meant finding new ways to contribute, to protect, and to lead by example. For now, though, the square was peaceful once more. The vendors resumed their calls, the tourists returned to snapping photos, and the children went back to chasing pigeons. Life moved on, as it always did. But for Marcus, the events of the afternoon would linger in his mind, a reminder that even in ordinary moments, extraordinary things could happen. The silence in the square was deafening as Derek knelt on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back by Marcus's firm but controlled grip. The once boisterous thug was now reduced to a figure of vulnerability, his earlier bravado shattered like glass. His face burned with embarrassment as he realized how quickly the tables had turned. What started as an attempt to assert dominance had spiraled into a public display of his own failure. And everyone was watching. Marcus didn't tighten his hold unnecessarily. He wasn't trying to humiliate Derek further. Instead, his actions were deliberate and measured, designed to neutralize the threat without causing lasting harm. But even so, the message was clear. Derek had picked the wrong person to mess with. As Derek squirmed under Marcus's restraint, his struggles grew weaker, less confident. It was as if the fight had been drained out of him, replaced by a dawning awareness of just how outmatched he truly was. "You're done," Marcus said quietly, his voice calm but commanding. "This doesn't have to go any further. Walk away while you still can." His words weren't meant to taunt or belittle. They were an olive branch, a chance for Derek to salvage what little dignity he had left. But Derek's pride refused to let him accept it gracefully. He muttered something under his breath, too low for anyone to hear clearly, though the venom in his tone was unmistakable. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, began to stir again. Some people clapped softly, impressed by Marcus's composure and skill. Others whispered among themselves, marveling at how effortlessly he had diffused the situation. A young woman standing near the front of the group pulled out her phone and began recording, capturing the moment for social media. Within minutes, the video would spread across platforms, turning Marcus into an unlikely hero. But that was something he wouldn't think about until much later. Meanwhile, Derek's resistance faltered completely. He stopped struggling and slumped forward slightly, his head hanging low. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might actually listen to Marcus's advice and walk away. But then, almost as if remembering where he was, Derek raised his voice again, shouting curses and threats toward Marcus. "You think you're tough, huh? Let me go, or I'll." His words trailed off when Marcus applied just a fraction more pressure to his wrist, enough to remind him who was in charge. "Or you'll what?" Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp but not cruel. "Keep embarrassing yourself in front of all these people." He glanced up briefly at the growing audience, their faces a mix of awe, amusement, and discomfort. "Is that really worth it?" Derek didn't answer. Instead, he gritted his teeth, his jaw clenched tight as he wrestled with his emotions. On one hand, he wanted nothing more than to lash out, to reclaim the control he felt slipping through his fingers. On the other hand, deep down, he knew Marcus was right. This wasn't going to end well for him. Not here, not surrounded by witnesses, and certainly not with someone as skilled and composed as Marcus calling the shots. As the seconds ticked by, Derek's breathing slowed, his body sagging slightly under Marcus's grip. Whether it was resignation or exhaustion, or perhaps both, it was clear that the fight had gone out of him. Sensing this shift, Marcus loosened his hold ever so slightly, giving Derek just enough room to move without fully releasing him. "Last chance," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Make the smart choice." For a fleeting moment, Derek hesitated, his mind racing. Then, with a muttered curse, he yanked his arm free and stumbled to his feet, glaring daggers at Marcus. Though he tried to mask it with anger, there was no mistaking the shame written all over his face. Without another word, he turned and pushed his way through the crowd, shoving past onlookers as he retreated toward the edge of the square. As Derek disappeared from view, the tension in the air lifted, replaced by a wave of relief and admiration for Marcus. People began to clap more enthusiastically now, some even cheering. One elderly man stepped forward, tipping his hat respectfully. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "We need more men like you around here." Marcus simply nodded, brushing off the praise with quiet humility. He hadn't acted out of a desire for recognition. He had done what needed to be done. Still, as he watched Derek vanish into the distance, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man. Everyone made mistakes, after all, even those who seemed intent on making life harder for others. And sometimes, all it took was a single moment of clarity to set someone on a different path. Derek's face twisted into a snarl at Marcus's words. "Walk away," he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you can tell me what to do?" He took another unsteady step forward, closing the gap between them. The veins in his neck bulged as he clenched his fists tighter, his entire body tensed like a coiled spring. To anyone watching, it was obvious that Derek wasn't just angry, he was desperate to prove something, though no one could quite figure out what. Marcus didn't flinch. His posture remained relaxed but alert, his weight evenly distributed on both feet. Years of training had taught him how to read people, and right now, every fiber of his being told him that Derek was unpredictable. Drunk, volatile, and spoiling for a fight. This was a dangerous combination. But Marcus also knew something else. Derek's aggression was rooted in insecurity. Men like him thrived on fear, feeding off the reactions they provoked from others. And Marcus refused to give him the satisfaction. The crowd around them grew larger, murmurs rippling through the onlookers. Some whispered nervously about calling the police, while others debated whether they should intervene. A few even cheered Derek on, egging him to make a move. "Go on, mate. Show him who's boss." One man shouted from the back, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Marcus ignored them all, keeping his focus squarely on Derek. Distractions were deadly, and he couldn't afford to lose sight of the threat in front of him. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying just enough authority to silence the hecklers momentarily. His eyes locked onto Derek's, unwavering and steady. "I don't want to hurt you, but if you force my hand, I will." It wasn't a boast, it was a promise. There was no malice in his tone, only certainty. Anyone who had ever served alongside Marcus would recognize that look in his eyes, the calm before the storm. But Derek didn't see it that way. To him, Marcus's composure was an insult, a challenge to his pride. "Hurt me, you," he scoffed, throwing his head back in drunken laughter. "What are you gonna do, huh? Talk me to death." His words were met with scattered chuckles from the crowd. Though many people looked uneasy, they could sense the tension building, like the calm before a lightning strike. Without warning, Derek lunged forward, swinging his fist with surprising speed for someone so intoxicated. The punch was wild and uncoordinated, aimed straight at Marcus's jaw. For a split second, it seemed like Derek might actually land the blow. Gasps erupted from the crowd as they braced themselves for impact. But Marcus wasn't ordinary. He was a veteran, trained to react in situations exactly like this. In one fluid motion, Marcus sidestepped Derek's swing, moving with precision and grace. Before Derek could recover, Marcus grabbed his wrist mid-motion, twisting it gently but firmly behind his back. The sudden shift in momentum caught Derek completely off guard. One moment, he was the aggressor, full of bravado. The next, he was on his knees, wincing in pain as Marcus applied just enough pressure to subdue him without causing harm. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds, but it felt like hours to those watching. The crowd fell silent, their eyes wide with shock. No one had expected such a swift resolution. Derek struggled against Marcus's grip, his earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of reality. "Let go of me," he growled, though there was a noticeable tremor in his voice now. Gone was the swagger, replaced by panic and humiliation. Marcus leaned down slightly, his mouth close to Derek's ear. "This is your chance to walk away," he murmured, his voice low but firm. "Don't make me regret giving it to you." His words weren't cruel. They were measured, almost compassionate, but they carried an undeniable edge, a reminder that Marcus was still very much in control. For a brief moment, Derek hesitated, his breathing ragged. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Would he double down on his aggression, or would he take the opportunity to save face? Either way, the outcome was far from certain, and everyone knew it. Derek's loud voice echoed across the square, slicing through the peaceful hum of conversation and laughter. Heads turned as people tried to figure out what was happening. Some stopped in their tracks, while others instinctively took a step back, sensing that this wasn't going to end well. Derek's heavy boots thudded against the cobblestones as he staggered forward, his movements clumsy but aggressive. His face was red, not just from the alcohol coursing through his veins, but also from the anger boiling inside him. "You. Yeah, you," Derek shouted again, jabbing a finger at Marcus. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as though Marcus had done something wrong simply by existing. Marcus, still leaning casually against the lamppost, raised an eyebrow. He didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, he studied Derek with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural given the situation. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It was calculation. Years of training had taught him to assess threats quickly, and right now, he was sizing Derek up. Derek, however, misinterpreted Marcus's silence as weakness. "What cat got your tongue?" he sneered, stopping a few feet away. His breath reeked of cheap beer, and his words slurred together, making him sound even more ridiculous. A small group of onlookers began to form a loose circle around them, whispering among themselves. Some looked concerned, while others appeared entertained, eager to see how this would play out. The royal guards stationed nearby shifted slightly, their heads turning ever so subtly toward the commotion, though they remained rooted in place for now. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through Derek's drunken rant like a knife. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. There was no trace of irritation or panic, just quiet confidence. To anyone watching, it was clear that Marcus wasn't intimidated, but Derek didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. All he saw was someone who wasn't backing down, and that only fueled his rage further. "Help me? Help you?" Derek spat, throwing his arms wide. "Who do you think you are, standing there all smug-like? You think you're better than everyone else, huh?" His voice rose with each word, growing louder and more unhinged. A young mother nearby grabbed her child's hand and pulled them closer, clearly uneasy about the escalating scene. Even the vendors paused their sales pitches, their eyes darting nervously between Derek and Marcus. Marcus straightened up slowly, pushing himself off the lamppost. He didn't move toward Derek, nor did he raise his fists. Instead, he stood tall, meeting Derek's glare with a level gaze. "I don't want any trouble," Marcus said evenly. His words were simple, but they carried weight. Anyone listening could tell he meant it. He wasn't looking for a fight. But Derek wasn't interested in reason. In his alcohol-fueled state, logic had long since abandoned him. "Oh, you don't want trouble," Derek mocked, taking another wobbly step closer. "Too bad, buddy. 'Cause trouble's here." He clenched his fists, cracking his knuckles for dramatic effect. The crowd murmured uneasily, some people stepping farther back while others craned their necks to get a better view. One teenager even pulled out his phone, ready to record whatever happened next. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Derek glared at Marcus, his chest heaving as he worked himself into a frenzy. Marcus, on the other hand, remained perfectly still, like a rock in the middle of a storm. His calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate Derek more. "You hear me, old man," Derek barked, leaning in aggressively. "You better start running, 'cause I'm gonna." Before he could finish his sentence, Marcus interrupted him, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. "Walk away," he said, his tone as yet controlled. "Do yourself a favor and leave before this gets worse." It was a warning, plain and simple. But Derek, blinded by arrogance and liquor, couldn't or wouldn't listen. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that this confrontation was far from over. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over the bustling city square. The air buzzed with energy as tourists wandered around, snapping photos of the grand palace that stood tall and proud at the heart of the city. Vendors lined the cobblestone streets, their carts overflowing with colorful fruits, handmade crafts, and steaming street food. Children laughed as they chased pigeons, while couples strolled hand in hand, soaking in the beauty of the historic surroundings. It was a scene straight out of a postcard, a perfect blend of history, culture, and life. Standing near one of the towering stone lampposts was Marcus Black. He wasn't dressed in anything flashy, just a simple jacket, jeans, and boots, but there was something about him that made people glance twice. His posture was upright, his shoulders relaxed yet strong, and his eyes carried a quiet intensity. Though he no longer wore the uniform of a soldier, it was clear that he had once served. The way he moved, the way he observed everything around him, it all spoke of discipline and years spent honing skills most people would never need. Marcus had returned home only a few months ago after serving overseas. Life back in the civilian world hadn't been easy for him. The transition from the battlefield to everyday routines felt strange, almost surreal. But today, he was just another face in the crowd, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of the square. Or so he thought. Nearby, stationed at the entrance of the palace, were members of the Royal Guard. Their crimson uniforms stood out against the neutral tones of the stone walls, and their polished helmets gleamed under the sunlight. They stood motionless, like statues, exuding authority and order. Tourists often stopped to take pictures with them, though the guards remained stoic, barely blinking. Marcus admired their dedication. He knew what it meant to stand firm in the face of chaos, even if the chaos here was nothing more than curious onlookers or playful kids trying to make them crack a smile. As Marcus leaned casually against the lamppost, watching the ebb and flow of the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the faint tension in the air, or perhaps it was just his instincts kicking in, a habit left over from his time in the military. Whatever it was, he decided to stay alert. Little did he know, his instincts were about to be put to the test. Across the square, a man emerged from a nearby pub. His loud voice cut through the hum of conversation like a knife. This man, Derek Hale, was built like a tank, with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos. He swaggered unsteadily, clearly drunk, his steps uneven as he pushed his way through the crowd. People instinctively stepped aside, not wanting to get in his path. Derek's face was flushed, his eyes wild, and his mouth curled into a sneer. He was looking for trouble. And unfortunately for everyone else, trouble seemed to find him first. When Derek spotted Marcus standing calmly by the lamppost, his lips twisted into a grin. "Hey you," he barked, pointing a finger. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around, unsure if the man was talking to someone else. But when Derek started shoving his way toward him, it became painfully obvious who the target was. And just like that, the calm of the afternoon began to unravel, setting the stage for a confrontation no one saw coming.